Resident Evil 4.
A reimagining of a 2005 classic rebuilt from the ground up, a remake of one of the greatest games of all time. Remaking a video game is never going to be an easy task, but when executed tastefully it can be a really prospective opportunity to bring old loved games to a modern audience, porting the premises and tone of the game into the AAA market that exists today. Capcom already have the best example of doing this in the past with 2019's Resident Evil 2. Beautiful graphics, high production value, more accessible and smoother gameplay, updated enemies, and an overall refined world. It was a universal success. But while Capcom have the best example of a remake done right, they also have one of the best examples of a remake done wrong. 2020's Resident Evil 3 was released to a mixed reception from fans, and while it is still an enjoyable experience, the game uses the original RE3's premise and the gorgeous world 2 already established as a crutch. Take away all of this and the game is a complete failure. So going into Resident Evil 4 Remake, I had three main concerns. Missing content. Firstly, the fear in the back of my mind that entire portions of the game would be cut out and that the game would be treated as an easy cash grab like what happened with RE3. Walking a tightrope. RE4 treads a very thin line between a completely over-the-top action game that couldn't take itself less seriously and a chilling horror experience. Going too far in either direction would be very easy and could ruin the remake. Touching greatness. The original 2 and 3 are very good games, they're classics, but the original RE4 is unanimously considered one of the greatest games of all time, and I have a strong personal connection to it. This means that it was going to be a harder task to pull off as a remake for me than arguably any game that Capcom has made in the last 20 years. So going into RE4 with all of these previous things listed in mind, there was a lot that could have gone wrong. Touching a piece of art that's as prestigious and acclaimed as this will always be difficult, but do I think they succeeded? We'll get into that. The first area I'm going to talk about is the story and characters. The RE4 remake follows the same overarching story as the original game, with a lot of changes on the way to the end goal, some significant, some insignificant, but overall the game still ends with the same results as the original. What I think the remake deserves a lot of praise for though is how much more nuanced and well developed the story and its characters are. To keep things short and a bit pretentious, this isn't a story about an undercover agent infiltrating rural Spain to rescue the government's daughter anymore. It's now a story about how Leon Kennedy, one of the sole survivors of the Raccoon City incident, is now giving a second opportunity to redeem himself and the victims of the outbreak in his mind by being tasked to rescue the government's daughter, on his way fighting an internal battle with trauma, people from his past, and creating a new life for himself. Now I know, isn't that a bit over-analytical for a Resident Evil game? Yeah, I wouldn't blame anyone for saying that. Most of my thoughts on this segment are just ramblings of a delusional fan, but I do firmly believe that this is the intended direction of the game's story. Don't get me wrong, there was nothing wrong with how the original was simply a fun action horror romp.
I'm sure you boys didn't just tag along so we could sing Kumbaya together at some Boy Scout bonfire. Then again, maybe you did.
Sorry I couldn't get in touch sooner, but I was a bit tied up.
Monsters. Guess after this there'll be one less to worry about.
The story served its purpose by creating an entertaining and engaging scenario, and just being fun. Not every game needs to be The Last of Us. In fact, I think it would be good if every game stopped trying to force a God of War Ragnarok type of story. It's simply not needed most of the time. But I want to emphasize how this isn't the case for RE4 Remake. The game has a good story, but there's a difference between a good story and a story that's unnecessarily trying to be super deep and taking up half your playtime. You can play through RE4, skip all the cutscenes, and still have a good time. I wouldn't recommend this because the story has a lot of substance to it and is really engaging, but my point still stands. This is because of the game's approach to narrative. It follows a design philosophy where the nuance and symbolism is all implicitly hinted at throughout the game in small doses and very subtly, but if you pay attention, all of the details start coming together and you can get a lot of meaning out of it, instead of there being big exposition dumps every 10 minutes. I want to clarify that I'm not necessarily saying that type of game is bad or can't be amazing. It's just becoming very forced into a lot of games, and I'm glad RE is sticking to its guns whilst being able to implement a great story still. As I previously mentioned in the overview, Leon's character is the driving force behind the story, and he is pretty much the ultimate protagonist. He's funny, witty, likeable as a vending machine of so bad it's good jokes.
Here I come!
So that's your true power? Oh, I'd ask for a refund.
Smart, well developed, and most importantly, while he's pretty much this Terminator of video game protagonists, he's still down to earth and relatable. I mean, who doesn't find themselves breaking into random Spanish people's houses and killing them, right? A really well presented aspect of Leon's character is his trauma from Raccoon City. The opening cutscene and the marketing of the game already establishes that his past is going to be a big part, and so most players already have this imprinted in their heads whilst playing, which makes a lot of the story beats more impactful as there are undertones that are more easily picked up on. As great as Leon is a miss, I honestly think Ashley steals the show in terms of improvement from the original characters. It's pretty crazy how she went from being easily the most infuriating and worst character from the original to now being one of the most likable. It probably helps that she doesn't scream every time she leaves your eyesight now, but she's also genuinely written really well. Ashley reacts to everything in a normal and expected way, which she did in the original too, but this time she has heartwarming dialogue with Leon which forms an attachment with her and the player. She'll do things like check if you are okay after a touching encounter, she'll sit on a barrel and cheer you on the minigames. She's just all around a wholesome character that you really root for as the player. Another method the game utilises to make her more likeable is this one scene in the castle. Ashley was possessed by Sadler and stabbed Leon whilst under his control, and the next time you encounter her, she's crying and Leon comforts her. I know this is pretty basic and not anything crazy narratively, but I'm a massive fan of this scene. I love how warmly lit the room is, and the overall atmosphere is just very heartwarming. This type of kind of flirty but kind and caring relationship between Leon and Ashley continues to develop throughout the rest of the game, reaching its climax in the final cutscene before the final chapter, where a dying Leon carries Ashley to Luis's lab and removes the plagas from her. This isn't only the culmination of their relationship, but it symbolises something much greater to Leon. In RE2, everybody around him died. He even was led to think Ada was dead too, and this builds up the trauma and the guilt within Leon, but he failed everybody. This is why the tagline of the game is, "This time has to be different." It's not referring to the remake being different, but Leon's journey being different. At this point, Leon has already lost Luis and Krauser, two people that were important to him, and it's beginning to look just like the Raccoon City incident all over again. But by curing Ashley, he breaks the cycle and breaks through his trauma. It's a beautiful scene if you pick up on the subtext, and this is what I was referring to when I said that the game's narrative is so good because of how implicitly it's told. The cherry on top that makes the scene even more powerful is that it takes place in Luis's lab, which symbolises Leon using the sorrow and pain from the people he's lost to drive him to make things different this time. And whilst we were on the topic of Luis, I'd be damned if I didn't mention how great he is here. At first I wasn't sure on how I felt about his redesign, and I still do prefer his old look in some ways, but as a character, it's night and day. He is actually respected by the writers here. He isn't tossed away in some undeserved and unsatisfactory death scene. As much as I look back on his original death scene with a sour taste, I have to confess that it was the first scene in the game that ever made me cry. 11-year-old me was so invested in this game, and I had such a big attachment to these characters, but it was really upsetting. And all this time later, I cried again at the same part. Except this time, it is so much more deserved, and is genuinely heartbreaking instead of just sad to a kid. The extra time you spend with Luis through the mines is one of my favourite additions to the game. I couldn't be more thankful that they killed him off later on so you actually get to see his motives and complexities within him. Luis, similar to Leon, is also fighting an internal battle within himself because of guilt. As the scientist who helped create Las Plagas, he holds himself accountable for the whole situation, and it's evident how much he is trying to repent and reverse what he's done, even if he doesn't show it. He also oozes charisma and is a really entertaining chemistry of Leon. Overall, Luis is just treated and written as an actual fleshed out character instead of just a tool to progress the plot. I'm aware that I keep talking down on the original game's story, but I don't even think it was a massive issue because it was just trying to tell a very different type of story. That type of story simply wouldn't have worked in the remake, and I'm glad that they've reworked all their shortcomings to now be major strengths. The way that Luis is killed is also one of, if not the best change in the entire game. Being introduced to Krauser in the mid-game instead of the final act is a drastic improvement in terms of establishing him as a character for more casual fans that don't know who he is, should be afraid of and resentful towards. Not only is having an actually important and powerful character kill Luis more respectful to him as a character, it creates more hatred from the player towards Krauser, and consequently makes the final encounter with him at the end of the game so much more worthwhile and rewarding. There's a lot of build up right before the Krauser boss fight, with him writing a note in blood on the back of a picture of Leon from the RPD. This is more amazing symbolism, as it's a reminder to Leon of how he failed. His choice to use a photo of Leon from RE2 holds a lot of weight, bringing the theme of his trauma from that game in as a subtext for the following sequence. The dialogue between Leon and Krauser all revolves around this core part of Leon's character in the remake, and the sequence is arguably the most important moment for Leon in the entire series. It was already climactic in the original, but by having such an upgrade in nuance and depth, the fight's more emotionally charged and powerful than ever, with Krauser confronting Leon about how he let the squad down and he's failed everyone around him. At this point, Krauser has too far gone down the path of insanity to be reasoned with. Krauser, defeated and bloodied on the ground, tells Leon to finish it. Leon picks up Krauser's knife and he sees himself in the reflection of it, adding to the rivalry and binary opposition, inferring how Leon has become what Krauser could have been. Throughout the game, he's only referred to Leon as Rookie, but right before Leon kills him, he finally refers to him as Leon. I think this is the game's way of implying that by defeating Krauser, Leon is now worthy of his respect and has overcome that identity he once had. This subtle detail is important because it symbolises Leon finally breaking past his trauma from the RPD. He's no longer the rookie cop from the Raccoon City outbreak, he's a Leon, and Krauser's death seen as the moment this pivotal change occurs and allows Leon to push through and save Ashley. Notice how all of these great characters I've just described all come back to one thing in particular: they all have an amazing relationship with Leon. This is what keeps the story so engaging throughout, by having every core character feel so personally resonant and connected to Leon, the protagonist that we feel attached to. We then feel attached to the rest of the characters, and it creates an unbelievably good flow to the narrative. How the remake handles Leon solidifies in my mind that he is one of, if not the greatest protagonist in a video game. Geralt, Kiryu, Solid Snake, Kratos, and Cloud come close, and I think maybe even all have more depth to them, but Leon is my personal favourite. Alongside the characters, the world building is also stronger than ever. While exploring the village, you'll read notes and stories of the villagers slowly losing their sanity and the life they lived before the cult brainwashed them. One particular story that stood out to me was the one of the grandfather and his grandchild. Minor anecdotes like this add so much to the world and the environment, while also humanising the villagers as real people that were indoctrinated by the cult. Now that I've gotten all my overwhelming praise for the remake story out of the way, let's address the elephant in the room: Ada. I want to start off by saying that it is never okay to harass, send threats to, or bully a voice actor because you're upset with a character's victim. Ada's voice actor has been the latest victim of this, and it's absolutely disgusting and incredibly embarrassing for the RE fanbase. Lily, sorry, I don't want to butcher her name, but Lily Gal released a statement on Instagram which I found really interesting, and I suggest you read if you're not up to date on this situation. Now on to Ada herself. I think she's pretty decent. I wouldn't say she's the best part of the game, she's definitely my least favourite of the core characters, but she is adequate for the most part. Bear in mind that she wasn't a massive part or standout at all in the original Space game. My main complaint about Ada is the first scene where we meet her. Think of it from Leon's perspective and in context with the narrative the game is trying to tell. Leon fell in love with Ada 6 years ago and there's no evidence that she survived the most traumatic event of his life. Seeing Ada in the flesh and confirming that she survived this night and he didn't fail her should have been a more heavy and emotionally resonant scene. What we got is still good, and it feels very James Bond-esque, but I can't help but think there could have been more done here. I don't have a problem with Ada's reaction to seeing him. Ada has always been a cold and manipulative character, which also explains Leon's caution. So I think that people expecting them to hug and have some warm reunion don't really understand the relationship between them. But on the other hand, I still think this was a missed opportunity for a more powerful moment instead of a pretty standard cutscene. I'm sure separate ways will flesh her out a lot more, and I'll have stronger opinions on her then. My other main criticism in terms of characters is that Sadler is underwhelming. He does have a threatening presence, and I think that the time he spends in the game is all pretty good, but that's the problem. He has about 10 minutes of screen time, which is really disappointing considering the glow up every other character in the game had. Similarly to Ada, he was never one of the stronger points of the original either, but this is still a missed opportunity where we could have expanded him into something much greater. To give evidence for my point, you don't even meet Sadler in the physical form until chapter 14 of 16. This means that the main antagonist of the game isn't even present for 87.5% of the runtime. The only time we see Sadler is through gloomy paintings and weird visions of him speaking through the plugger. It's also worth mentioning that Chief Mendez and Salazar both grown out Sadler's name in their dying scenes, so I guess that adds a little bit of foreshadowing. But if you're a new Resident Evil fan who hasn't played the original, all of this foreshadowing means completely nothing, because you won't know who the hell Sadler is in the first place. What makes this frustrating is that it wasn't a problem with the original at all. He wasn't some Wesker level villain, but at least he was consistently built up through the story and was a constant presence. I will say that the first scene you meet him in is fantastic. The coldest imagery and the people wrapped in all white body bags are nightmare material. The problem is that scenes like this show that the potential of a cult is never met, when it could have been something along the lines of Midsummer and how creepy it is in the last act. And this last act is both the game's biggest narrative strength and its weakness. The story becomes so much more complex and thematically resonant in this third act compared to the rest of the game. Whilst the story is genuinely incredible throughout the island section, that same depth simply isn't found at the village and castle. Those first two acts are mainly just set up, and while I think the village is the overall strongest part of the game, I just wish that same narrative depth was maintained throughout its runtime, instead of only becoming prevalent in the final few hours. But still, with those criticisms aside, I'm extremely pleased with the game's story and characters. I think this is easily the best story ever told in a Resident Evil game, and the storytelling techniques, the narrative themes and motifs, the character arcs, all outstanding and incredible improvements over the original game. This is easily one of the strongest parts of the remake, and I'm so glad that Capcom took this opportunity to transform the story from a serviceable afterthought into a really special story from the horror genre. Resident Evil 4 is a third-person shooter that blends action and horror, but at its core the combat system is a pure action game through and through. The reason it's still considered as a horror game is because of the external factors and the situation this core gameplay loop is placed into. In general combat you have three main options: aimable weapons. Guns, grenades, eggs, and anything that you can throw or shoot in a trajectory counts under this category. Using a knife. There are three knives you can acquire in the main story: Leon's regular one, the one that you pick up from Krauser during chapter 14, and disposable ones that can be looted from enemies in the game's environment. But you have one primary knife for most of your first playthrough. All knives have durability, but only the lootable ones can break permanently. Melee. Attacking an enemy in a critical area or by executing a sequence of well-placed attacks can leave an enemy open to a melee hit, prompted by a button displayed. Melee attacks include roundhouse kicks and a suplex that is unlocked once you reach the game's second act. These elements are what build up the combat loop, and this core combat stays the same throughout the game, with the weapons you use and the scenarios that Leon is placed into being what keeps the combat constantly fresh. These three elements build up a smooth cycle of actions that are constructed to all flow into each other. Using a gun can stun an enemy, so you can use a melee attack, which can then knock an enemy on the ground where you can then use your knife on them. This is purposefully done to create an engaging experience where utilising all of your toolkit is the key to success. To expand on the usage of these elements, there are 20 weapons available in your first playthrough. 5 handguns, 3 shotguns, 3 rifles, 2 submachine guns, 2 magnums, the mine thrower, an RPG, and 3 types of grenades. These can and should all be used in an array of situations depending on the urgency and the ammo you have available. Your handgun of choice is the basic weapon you will use for 75% of encounters though, but you will very rarely run out of handgun ammo. I could count the times I ran out of ammo on my first playthrough on one hand. I'm going to come out and say that I think the concept of a game giving you multiple choices on every weapon type is a fantastic feature. In other Resident Evil games, you simply have one handgun, one shotgun, etc. But giving you the choice works so well because it gives the player the opportunity to communicate with the game through their personal identity by offering choice and upgrades which can all appeal and resonate to the individual consumer in different ways. No two weapons serve the same purpose and none are completely clear of others in their class. Every weapon has its reasons to be used and they are all balanced fairly to the point that the only relevant factor for deciding which gun you should invest in is the one that suits your playstyle the best. I also think that this encourages replayability to try out all the other weapons you didn't use. Knives are best used depending on how comfortable you are with the game's mechanics. If you're new, I wouldn't recommend using a knife aggressively for any purposes other than attacking an enemy that's been knocked, or if you've been prompted to escape a grab by using one. The more experienced you are with how different enemies react to your movements, and just how the game controls in general, you can start implementing knife strikes into your regular combat as a substitute for handgun. Using the knife to poke enemies in the eye or pop their kneecaps and make them open for a melee is some of the most fun and seamless gameplay I've ever experienced in a shooter. Another aspect of a knife I love is the parry. This is a new feature in the remake that is so simple but such a genius feature. I'm blown away nobody has ever thought of this before. By simply tapping the button to ready your knife, you can parry incoming attacks, therefore working as a dodge mechanic of sorts. But if you perfectly time the parry to negate incoming damage just as the attack lands, then you can execute what's called a perfect parry, which immediately resumes your control over Leon and opens up the enemy to a melee attack. This is very similar to the parry in Dark Souls, for example, and it adds a dynamic to the combat that simply wasn't there in the original. This feature also encourages aggression as opposed to RE3's awkward attempt at a dodge mechanic. The reason the knife parry is so effective is because it stops gameplay from ever halting or becoming just shoot, melee, shoot, repeat. The existence of a parry allows for the enemies to become more aggressive and smarter with the way that they approach you, allowing for more complex and well executed level design and enemy placement than there was in the original. Melee attacks are best suited for crowd control, or to find an opening out of an oppressive scenario. This was one of the most unique and innovative aspects to the original game, and I'm happy to see these melee attacks returning in all their fucking ridiculous glory. A couple of extra changes to the original's combat that are worth noting are that 1. You can now run while shooting. This was always something I really appreciated because it increased the tension dramatically, but I understand this is simply not an applicable mechanic to implement in a AAA 2023 shooter. I actually appreciate this change, as all it means is that if your movement as Leon is less tense, then the enemies and level design need to make up for this, which I think they do and then some. As a result, very little of the tension is lost because you can now move while shooting. 2. You can quick swap to weapons instead of having to go through your inventory every time you want to switch to your riot gun from your Red 9, and I don't see where anybody could have a problem with this. 3. Stealth is now an option. I'm not going to come on here and lie, saying it's going to dethrone MGS5 as the king of stealth gameplay. Realistically, this is pretty average stealth. You have your usual options of crouching and sneaking up on enemies to get a silent takedown with your knife. It's a fine feature that can add a bit more variety to how you want to play, but there was definitely a lot of room left uncovered in terms of innovation and just overall enjoyability of the stealth. Who knows, maybe the RE5 remake's going to be a full stealth game with Chris and Shiva crawl around in cardboard boxes and perform CQC on Wesker. And now we've outlined the more nuanced details of a core game design, you can see that while, yeah, it is simple on the surface, there's a lot of thoughtfulness and smart reasoning behind every single aspect of it. In the time where you're not committing felonies by breaking into random villagers' houses and then roundhouse kicking their skulls in when they try to defend themselves, you'll be traversing the world and solving puzzles. The blend of combat and other navigation has a really nice flow to it that feels pretty natural. Puzzles are generally pretty simple, but they're satisfying. They typically involve you aligning different visual structures to create a symbol. I do think that the puzzles could have had a lot more work done on them. For example, there's this section in chapter 9 when you're in the castle and are looking for 3 animal heads to put on a statue, but once you find them, that's it. That's all you need to proceed. This was a missed opportunity to use some kind of mechanic where you need to rotate them so that if you look at the shadow, it creates the outline of a lost Plagas insignia, for example. Not the greatest idea, but even something like that would have been a lot more entertaining. And it kind of just feels like they just ran out of time to add that puzzle. Regardless, I do think that the puzzles are a nice addition and they are still an improvement upon the original, so I'm not going to stay on this topic. Now I want to move on to the other half of Resident Evil 4's combat that works in tandem with Leon's abilities, the enemies, and how you encounter them. Let's outline the structure of how the enemies work in each act of the game because each act follows a similar gameplay code. So I've broken down the enemies you fight the game into 3 categories excluding the bosses. Category 1, Mobs. These are the basic enemies you'll be fighting for 90% of the game and they all have a few different attacks they can choose from. The village has the Ganados, who are villagers that are the standard template for the other variants. They use hatchets, pitchforks, their fists, and any other weapon they can find. The castle has the cultists, who work pretty much the same as the Ganados except for one really subtle but notable change I picked up on. A lot of the cultists wear these long dresses that go down to their feet, whereas even the female Ganados only have dresses that go down to their knees, and so you can still see their legs. This is actually relevant to gameplay, I'm not just being creepy. The kneecaps are one of 2 primary critical areas on the mobs. Either shooting the knee or the face exposes the enemies to a melee attack, and so these long dresses actually cover up the knees, so it's ultimately a guessing game of trying to figure out where the kneecaps are. You can shoot straight through their legs, which is something that can happen pretty often. A couple of cultists also wear helmets, but it's not frequent. There is a very strong variant of them called the Summoner, who is the red one with a deer skull that makes any encounters so much harder. I think this enemy is fine on repeat runs or once you've mapped out an encounter, but they can be problematic on your first playthrough. The only real tactic to get past sections of summoners efficiently is to rush them straight down, which you don't really figure out straight away as you're not given any incentive to do so, which leads to it coming down to trial and error on your first playthrough, especially if you run harder difficulty. This is a trap the Uncharted games fall into as well, where it takes you out of the atmosphere and I imagine can be immersion breaking. Resident Evil 4 is a video game through and through and doesn't rely completely on the spectacle like Uncharted however, so this is a nitpick more than anything. Moving on to the soldiers, who are the island's mob enemy. These guys feel closer to the Ganados than the cultists, and while the cultists cover their knee weakness, the soldiers mostly wear helmets that cover their face. I think this is a really solid evolution as you can still hit the knees in the castle, it's just harder, but the helmets completely eliminate your ability to get a crit on the head unless you shoot the helmet off, and I think this is a pretty natural evolution in the game's difficulty curve. The weapons they use have a refreshing mix up here, with tasers joining the mix. A gameplay presence that I love, as being stunned and having your control taken away from you in a horror game dramatically increases the tension. Now, killing a mob enemy has a possibility to transition into my second type of enemy, Plagas. Plagas have a weird tentacle things with knives on the end, and they evolve throughout the game. For example, the variant you meet in the castle that can eat your face is a massive spike in difficulty and horror from the regular ones. As soon as one of these Plagas appears, the situation becomes infinitely more intense, and these fuckers can jump around planks, swallow Leon's face, and absorb a lot of damage. I think this new addition to the remake is honestly fantastic. The fact you can only deal damage when they open their mouth is such a good new change, because it makes you have to involve tactics and precision instead of pushing the gameplay loop into a mindless shooter. In the heat of the moment, these enemies can be incredibly annoying and sometimes frustrating, but I think enemies like this, where the mere presence of them alone takes encounters to a new level, is a great thing overall. Now on to my third and final type of enemy, the dickheads. I was originally going to call these mini-bosses, but I decided against it, so they're too common to be mini-bosses, so I've just called them what they are, dickheads. The purpose of the dickheads is to stop a player from becoming comfortable in the gameplay loop, which would reduce the horror side of the game. Instead, the presence of Dr. Salvador, for example, is, for a lack of a better term, fucking terrifying. Picture this, you have 8 different rabid villagers surrounding you, all with murderous intent. But you're Leon S. Kennedy, you can simply pop their kneecap off and roundhouse kick them all into the Kingdom Hearts universe. Then you hear the revving of a chainsaw from a distance. You start to realise that maybe these 8 villagers might not actually be so easy, as they're all circling around you. Then one grabs you from behind and you see a man with a hay bag over his head, with blood-coated slits for eyes and a chainsaw charging towards you as you're being held in place by the mobs. This is the genius of these mini-bosses. Their presence instantly shifts the way you perceive the game. The knowledge you can be killed in a single hit if you make even a small mistake radically changes the way you play the game. And what's the best part of all this? It doesn't sacrifice the action aspect either. You can parry Dr. Salvador's chainsaw with a knife. Yes, parry a chainsaw with a knife. This is one of the most over-the-top action abilities in the entire series, but it's still taking place in one of the scariest sections of the village. This is what I think is done masterfully, walking the tightrope between campy action and chilling horror like I mentioned in the intro. But let's talk about the actual design of these enemies and not just their impact. So the guy I've just been mentioning, Dr. Salvador, is probably the most iconic enemy in the entire Resident Evil series, and I believe that he's the most integral part of 4's identity as a grisly rural horror adventure. Salvador's chainsaw is a one-hit kill that can be intercepted by a successful parry, which you're given a prompt for in this case. He also has an attack where he does a full-on charge at you, which can be incredibly hard to dodge depending on where you're positioned. I think this is great because it makes you have to bear in mind your immediate surroundings and then escape plan at all times, as the chainsaw sprint can't be parried. My only complaint about Salvador is that the flaming chainsaw variant from that secret hard mode in the demo doesn't make any appearances. It would have been an incredible moment to have an encounter where the guy comes sprinting through a wall and sets on fire loads of granados as he mows them all down whilst charging at you or something like that. Imagine this happening when you return to the area you first meet Salvador. This time it's at night and you have Ashley to worry about as well. Again, this is just me nitpicking, but I wouldn't be able to call this a critique if I didn't mention things like this. There's a variant of Salvador that makes its glorious comeback in the remake in the form of the Bella sisters. They are easily some of the scariest enemies in the entire game, and the encounter you first have with them is nothing short of incredible. I love how cinematic the cutscene is with both sisters using their chainsaws to break through the wall of that cabin, as you have a really intense and claustrophobic fight against 2 of these terrifying Salvadors. They operate pretty much identically to Salvador from my experience, but the visual design and the simple fact there's 2 of them is enough to make this an incredibly memorable experience over what was already one of the sections I always dreaded from the original. I think it could have been nice if they were given a unique attack or something along those lines, but it is entirely possible that they do have unique movesets and I just didn't notice. The castle's mini-boss comes in the beautiful and bubbly form of a Garrador. I'm just gonna come out and say it. The Garrador is easily one of the biggest improvements from the original game, and I always adored the first fight with this guy in the original. But here it's on a completely new level. The build-up is fantastic, with most players knowing what's coming from the sounds alone, and then the incredibly intense part where you're in that dimly lit room with all the chains, and the music is pulsating hard enough to break your ears. It's just incredible. However, the Regenerators are by far the best enemies in the game, and maybe even my favourite sequence from the entire Resident Evil series. The Regenerators won't need an introduction for most players. These guys have always been the most notoriously scary enemy in the game, and is every RE4 fan's go-to response when somebody says, RE4 isn't horror. But no, this is horror. The knowledge that these abominations were coming up made the section even more intense as I was dreading meeting them from the moment I reached the island. I had been anticipating them for the whole last year since the game got announced, and I still wasn't ready for that moment where one first sluggishly walks into the room with that sinister grin on its face. This is legitimately nightmare fuel. What now ensues is a 30-minute long segment of pure terror as you maneuver your way around a system of areas in which 3 regenerators roam the halls of the freezer and you have no way of fighting back for yourself. Think about it. Through all of RE4 you've been fighting back. You've been put in the shoes of a one-man army with access to military super weapons and close core to combat skills of both your body and knife of Solid Snake. But now, even when you still have all this equipment on you, it's useless. You can't do anything to these unnerving and unnatural creatures except run and pray you stab it in the neck before it rips your head off. The movements of these things are probably my favourite thing about them. The way they sluggishly and lazily waddle around and then throw their bodies across the room onto you and do the worm across the floor at you would honestly be hilarious if the game didn't do such an immaculate job of building atmosphere. Enduring all of this makes the moment you finally get the thermal scope even more rewarding, albeit still terrifying. From here on out, you encounter the regenerators a couple more times and then meet their even scarier and even stronger variant, the Iron Maiden. If the regenerators were nightmare fuel, then these are enough to power up the car in a second and drive you straight to Freddy Krueger's dream world. They have javelin-length spikes pop out of them from all places and decimate you if you're not careful. But we still haven't reached the scariest encounter with regenerators yet, the sack freezer. Right after you've taken down Krauser and you're feeling pretty much untouchable, the game throws you into this devastatingly terrifying scenario where you have to creep through a freezer room which is black body bags hanging from the ceiling. That's pretty scary alone, but what's worse is that they're moving, and you know exactly what's in them. The insanely high levels of tension in this room is really something that Capcom hit a stroke of genius with. I remember having to take a massive deep breath after I finally made it through without touching any of the body bags. This room is a testament to how incredibly good Capcom have become when it comes to horror level design, and this is the most evidence I can use to back up my claim at the start of the gameplay section. Resident Evil 4 has an action combat loop that is surrounded by an externally horror experience. Capcom knows this and plays by this rule to the most benefit possible. It's also important to remember that as good as the shooting and combat loop is, this is still a horror game. To put it bluntly, I think this game is far scarier than the original, with some of the most horrifying and disturbing moments in any modern RE game. The darker tone the game conveys through its cover art, the lighting, and how weighty every action feels helps to reinforce the horror. The power of the RE engine is also vital in creating a sense of tension. Leon is now constantly doing small actions like checking his guns are reloaded and looking around him. All these actions create a sense of unease and rising tension like somebody is watching you, which makes the time that somebody tries to stab you with a chainsaw even more terrifying. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like the game is still scary after my first 2 playthroughs, because it wasn't. But for a horror game, that first playthrough is what matters most in terms of fear, and I was genuinely freaked out by some moments. That guy running out of the oven on fire made me jump just as much as it did in the original. The last topic I want to mention before I finish up the gameplay section is the boss fights. I honestly don't have that much interesting to say about them, except that I think they're all pretty good, and vast improvements on their respective fights from the original. I'll delve into Krauser's fight more in the story section, but it's mechanically flawless and probably the best boss fight from the entire Resident Evil series. What they did to Salazar's fight is also really good, and they turned one of the most boring and underwhelming fights from the original into a really satisfying and experimental usage of the arena. Vertigo, who was always my favourite boss from the original game, is back in all of his chilling, sewer Roman glory. My only complaint about Verdugo is that I wish they made it clearer you could still kill him, although I guess it was more of a secret in the original game too. I made a very stupid mistake and went into the elevator instead of actually killing him on my first playthrough, because I had used all the nitrogen and he was still alive, so I actually under the impression that they'd removed the ability to kill him in the remake, which did initially really disappoint me, but I've since found out on repeat playthroughs that I was wrong and you can still kill him. One topic that I'm actually pretty unsure how I feel about is the removal of a boss fight with U3. To my knowledge, this is the only enemy in the game that was cut, and it's an interesting choice to remove this one, as it was always arguably one of the best and most memorable fights from the original. So I am pretty sad and disappointed that we didn't get to see this boss make it into the remake, because the fight was already really dynamic and cinematic for 2005, so imagine the possibilities in this engine. But there are a couple of reasons I'm holding off from saying this choice is a straight up flaw of a game. First of all, U3 might not even be cut from the game. At the time of writing this, Separate Ways isn't out yet, and I'm holding out hope that we're still going to be able to fight U3, but this time as Ada. This could make the fight even better than the original, as Ada can grapple, which means you'd be able to grapple along the cage, and so it could be a massive improvement. The other reason I'm not straight up criticizing it is because I actually think the existence of this boss in the game could have been problematic in terms of pacing. The last act of RE4 felt almost like a boss rush in the original game, with you fighting 3 bosses within only 2 chapters. The removal of this boss helps with janky and honestly outdated game design philosophy from breaking the immersion and flow of a game. So as long as U3 appears in Ada's campaign, you can consider this additional praise to the bosses, but for now it's just a matter of waiting and seeing. I don't have much to say about the other bosses, except how good they are, even the ones that haven't been changed much. For example, Del Lago was probably the worst fight in all of the original, and they haven't actually touched it mechanically at all, except when he disappears. But even though they haven't changed the mechanics, the fight is still improved upon because of how much more grandiose and how much of a spectacle it is. Having this colossal sea creature thrashing around and leaping out of the water into the sky is breathtaking and simultaneously terrifying. This improvement can be summed up to the technical limitations of 2005 compared to 2023, but I do think there's also a clear artistic evolution in the vision for the boss fights, in terms of atmosphere and visuals. Overall, I think the gameplay uses the original's blueprint and adds new mechanics to keep the game feeling modern and fresh, in a pretty amazing way that raises the bar for not just the gameplay in remakes, but the gameplay in any third-person shooter out there. Well, the biggest piece of side content in the game is by far the remake of Ada's DLC, Separate Ways. I might make a separate video talking about the DLC, so I'm going to keep this brief. Overall, Separate Ways is a great addition that works perfectly as a counterpiece to Leon's main story, and it feels more like a part of the game's base story rather than a DLC, which is the most you can ask for from an expansion this size. Despite the short runtime of 4 hours, Ada and Luis are both developed quite a lot through those hours, and Wesker's bigger role was fantastic to see. Couldn't be more excited for the RE5 remake because the way they've built up his plan here is great. Ada has a couple of new gameplay additions such as grappling and a tracking device. They're cute, but not anything groundbreaking. Even though Separate Ways is a really enjoyable experience, there were moments in the story which left me thinking that modern Resident Evil games are at their best when they already have great source material to build off. The original Separate Ways was very average and didn't add much, if anything, to the game. The remake's version is still very good, but it doesn't come close to matching the main story of Remake RE4, mainly because the source material for Leon's side is so much stronger than Ada's side. Of course, you could argue that this is just the nature of a £60 major release versus a £10 DLC, in which you would be partly right. Separate Ways is easily worth a very low price tag. My view is still that the modern renditions of old games is where Resident Evil is currently striving. Even look at RE8, a game I loved. The reason I loved that game was because of all the callbacks and striking similarities to the original RE4. I guess what I'm saying is that I just hope the future of the mainline entries will be able to maintain Capcom's recent quality while providing something original and unique for the series. Because Separate Ways is at its best when we're going through original RE4 set pieces that were cut from a remake. Just compare the intensity and brilliance of a U3 fight to the new 3-minute chase sequence with a lizard type creature. That whole sequence would fall flat and be underwhelming if it wasn't for the fucking awesome laser hallway scene, which is from the original RE4. So while I do stand by the opinion that this is a really, really good DLC, especially for the price, it just raises a few concerns around the series' future, but maybe I'm completely overthinking it. There's a lot of side content in this game that creates a nice loop where you're constantly working towards something. Following the pattern of the previous remakes, you gain points from completing challenges, beat the game on professional mode with an A rank. You can then use the points you get from these challenges to unlock concept art, character models, new weapons, cosmetics, and more. This system is a great incentive to keep on playing the game because you will always be encouraged to having a new goal. For example, you first need to beat the game to play Mercenaries, then you need to get good scores on Mercenaries to unlock the hand cannon, which you can then use to get an S rank professional to then unlock the Chicago typewriter, and so on and so on. You always have something to work towards long after finishing your first playthrough. And this works because the base gameplay is so good that the player feels compelled to keep playing the game anyways. As with all Resident Evil games, this isn't the type of thing where you just play through once and never touch again. These games are specifically built for replaying through the story multiple times and mastering the mechanics, and this design philosophy is as present in Forza Remake as it ever has been in the series. Outside of the main stories, there are 2 major other things to do. Most importantly, Mercenaries makes its return in all of its glory. For those who are unaware, this is a classic arcade type of game mode that's been in the series for decades now and is a fan favourite. In this entry, you have 3 stages of each of the story's 3 main locations: the village, the castle, and the island. There are 4 playable characters with a roster consisting of Leon, Luis, Krauser, and Hunk. Compared to the original game, there's one key difference here: Ada is gone and Luis has been added. At this point in time, it's completely speculation, but I have a theory that Ada's gameplay is either still being worked on for separate ways, or Capcom just don't want to spoil how she'll play before the DLC comes out because it could have killed the hype. Either way, I don't care for now. As long as we do get Ada's gameplay either in the form of separate ways or if she's just added to the Mercenaries roster further down the line. I think Luis being added is a great addition with his much more important role in the remake. He controls well and feels like a slightly altered version of Leon that's more focused on handgun gameplay. But Krauser is the one that really stands out above the rest of the lineup. His melee and knife attacks are fast, strong and altered heavily from Leon, so he now also does a dash when you first go into an attack. Krauser is bulkier and weightier to control than the others, but I like the power you feel while controlling him. He also has a great bow that shoots explosive arrows to deal with salvadors or big hordes of enemies, and he also is by far the most interesting power up once you fill up his bar. He then transforms into the final phase of his boss fight from the main game's story. You gain access to his mutated arm and can either hack and slash with combos or use the stinger attack, which is straight from Devil May Cry. I know that there isn't really a way to make the other characters this interesting just by nature of their characters, but it would have been nice to see the same effort that went into Krauser to have gone into the rest of the roster. Hunk also makes his return here, and he is fucking broken. All you need to do is send one quick TMP shot to the knee, and then you can instantly break the neck of any stunned enemy. He is completely unbalanced, but it's Mercenaries. Who wants balance in an arcade game mode? Overall, Mercenaries is fantastic, and maybe even deeper into the original as the best Mercenaries we've ever had in the series. The other main thing to do outside of the story is the shooting range. This isn't anything too crazy, but it's a nice way to practice your aim and improve your gun handling skills. I do really love that a remix version of the iconic Spanish folk music from the car ride in the original kicks in if you reach bonus time. The first time hearing that was really nostalgic and made me feel like the devs just really understand this game and what it means to the fans. Whilst we're on the topic of music, I want to quickly go over the music and overall presentation of a remake. In short, it's incredible. I'm not the type of guy that loves graphics and cares about specs, but this game is a technical masterpiece. It might be the best looking game I've ever played. The environments feel like paintings, and aesthetically, it's also strongly presented to feel like a true gothic horror experience, while still retaining the uniqueness RE4 has in its setting of a village in rural Spain. The characters are all beautiful and look incredible, but not verging on photorealistic in a way that would hold back the escapism element of gaming. The music is also a step up in some ways from the original and features both chilling and really grandiose and epic tracks. However, I do think that the original have a specific tone and atmosphere created by its ambience that just isn't here in the remake. The coldness, beauty and melancholy that was the original game's tone just isn't the same as in the original, and it's definitely less unique as far as atmosphere goes. But this is the type of thing that's incredibly hard to recapture in a remake. The only time I've seen the pure emotion and atmosphere recaptured perfectly in a remake is the Final Fantasy VII remake, so I don't hold this as a flaw against RE4, but I still think it's worth noting that the power of the original's ambience and tone isn't the same here. There's a video that got heavily criticised a bit back titled Soul vs Soulless about the original with a remake. I wouldn't ever say that the game is soulless at all, but it is lacking the same spark and feeling the original had. Maybe it's just nostalgia speaking, but the original game creates a feeling that it's hard to express in words for me, and the remake simply doesn't create that feeling. Otherwise, I don't know too much to say on the technical front, except that this is a high budget AAA experience in every sense of the phrase. The game would be a treat to play even if the game itself was mediocre. It just so happens that the game isn't anywhere near mediocre, and so this results in one of the best single player experiences you can have in 2023. It's been hard not to address this through what I've written so far, but before my final verdict, I want to give a bit of context into my personal experience with Resident Evil 4 and what the game means to me. I'm going to be doing this in every retrospective I do, because I believe that all of our perspectives come from a place of bias, so I want to give a bit of insight to my experience with the game. I first played Resident Evil 4 when I was 11, and it was the third single player game I had ever played through. Ever since I finished the game, it has stayed as a big part of my life and one of my favourite pieces of media to ever be created. Everything about the game connected with me. The setting, the characters, the gameplay, the aesthetic, it all just resonated with me in a way that it's hard to express with words. Leon was one of my childhood heroes. The same theme is practically ingrained into my head. I have so much nostalgia with this game, but just hearing the track Serenity can make me tear up. The memories I have with the original game can't be replicated, and they were a formative part in curating my taste in media as an adult. Horror is my favourite genre. I love everything dark and rural. There's only a few other games that have had this exact same impact on me. So I just want to put into context that Resident Evil 4 is incredibly important to me, and whether or not I think the remake has surpassed it, Above all, I'm just so happy that it turned out to be a phenomenal experience. Most importantly, the remake has reinforced and increased my love for RE4, not just for video game, not just for 2005 product, but Resident Evil 4 as an iconic staple of pop culture, gaming history, and the horror genre as a whole. So I'm not going to say if a game I've been talking about in this video is better or worse than the original, because I don't think that really matters. What matters is that the remake was an absolute success through and through, and stands tall alongside the Elden Rings, the God of War Ragnaroks, and the Witch 3 as modern masterpieces of this generation. I can confidently say that it's not going to have anywhere near the same impact as those games did, or even the original RE4 did. That's just impossible for a remake to ever achieve. But as far as pure enjoyability and sheer quality goes, this type of game doesn't come around very often, and it's up there in the game of a decade conversation for me. Overall, Resident Evil 4 Remake works together with the original as a single entity to create one of the greatest video games of all time.